Welcome to Fantasy View, this podcast of mine that never took off because people aren't that much into the written word anymore. Outside of texting and sexting, I suppose. It's been a while since I made a new episode, but I felt obliged to continue as I read the beginning of Magica by Clive Barker. Barker, whose story The Hellbound Heart led to the movie Hellraiser, is well known for horror. But Magica, if it was first published today, would be called more of a portal fantasy. Back in 1991, it was probably called something else. Thanks to articles by the author printed right at the book's beginning, I was exposed to some story spoilers. But I guess that's on me, since I was warned about them. It seems like Barker was hung on the idea of other dimensions, other planes of existence that had magic and monsters, like in the Odyssey. Stephen King was the same way. Just check out stories like Desperation and Black House. Not to mention the granddaddy of all King stories, The Dark Tower. I had been meaning to get to it if I kept on with this podcast, but as I was sipping margaritas while reading Magica, I felt inspired to just go ahead and do it. I'll try to be vague about plot details so as to avoid spoilers, but I make no guarantees. The first installment is the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger is the main character who is constantly called that in the first chapter, until King later settled on a name for him, Roland. He's chasing after the Man in Black, who is not Johnny Cash. Although if it was, that would be the most Stephen King thing ever. On the way, the gunslinger befriends a teenage boy from Earth, gets seduced by a goddess, fights mutants in an old mine, has his fortune read, and guns down an entire town that had risen against him. Yes, really. I've been fortunate enough to have read both the original and revised editions. King had revised this volume to make it more in line with the rest of the series. You see, a young Stephen King had written the chapters for publication in a magazine, meaning to make something as truly epic as The Lord of the Rings. But he hadn't planned out the series in its entirety. Or rather, he had some ideas, but later abandoned them. I think it's a shame that there's a revised edition at all, because I loved the long chat that the Gunslinger and the Man in Black had at the end of the original. The Man in Black warned him about the Beast. To speak of the Beast, he said, was to risk the damnation of your soul. Doesn't that sound cool? Couldn't that have possibly been better than what we ended up getting? I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but if you've read the books already, you know what I mean. The revised edition isn't as cool. In fact, it contains a contradiction that King might not have meant to put in. It has to do with the identity of the Man in Black, and of what the Gunslinger says about him much later in the fourth book. The second installment is the Drawing of the Three. I didn't care much for it at first, but over time it grew on me. This might sound nuts, but I think of this book as like that He-Man movie with Dolph Lundgren, but on crack. Roland the Gunslinger finds himself on a beach where a door appears, hanging in midair. Roland steps through and finds himself in the head of a man on an airplane with bags of coke strapped on his body. Shenanigans ensue. Eventually, Roland pulls the man, named Eddie, into his world, for it's up to Eddie to help Roland reach the Dark Tower, which he feels compelled to enter. Eddie, for his part, is less than thrilled. Another door leads Roland to the head of a woman in the 60s, who was born into privilege and has split personalities. I swear King decided that the best way to explain her situation was to make a run-on sentence, kept alive with countless semicolons, for 5 pages. Lunacy or secret genius? You decide, although I bet that'd be frowned upon these days. Unless the author is famous, like Stephen King. The woman, Odetta, is also pulled through the door to be Roland's companion, although she and her psychopathic other personality, Detta, are also none too thrilled. A third door leads Roland to a man in the 70s who's also a psycho, although he's more subtle about it. I'll just leave it at that. Overall, the book's pretty amusing, what with the culture clash between Roland and the different decades in New York City. It's the kind of portal fantasy that I don't think a lot of authors today are making, but they should, even if they get accused of copying Stephen King. The Wastelands is the third installment, and this is my favorite of the entire series. The content is just what I wanted from the series, a group of heroes journeying across the land, setting eyes on spectacular sights. One of these sights is a giant grizzly bear with a satellite dish on top of his head. Oh, Stephen King, you little scamp. Roland gets to know his companions better, and said companions become resigned to helping him. A good chunk of the first half takes place in New York, where young Jake is losing his mind due to a time paradox that Roland had caused in the last book. The author does his usual thing of having characters figure things out in streams of consciousness, although sometimes, well, many times, they act as if some higher power is speaking to them. The second half has our heroes, now reunited with Jake, taking a rest in a village that Roland doesn't have to gun down this time, and it continues with a frantic chase through a maze made up of modern-day appliances, such as computers and blenders. Our heroes eventually step inside a futuristic train run by an AI called Blaine, which is one of the most fascinating adversaries King has ever made. King is pretty good at making psychopathic characters who are full of themselves, which is scary in and of itself, and the repartee between Blaine and our heroes is pretty entertaining, and unsettling considering how AI is these days. It's also pretty interesting how the book ends with a cliffhanger that not even King himself knew how to resolve at the time of writing. Their fourth installment is Wizard and Glass. A strange title is like a continuation of the previous book, where each chapter was called Something and Something. I hear many readers call this one a disappointment, but I like it well enough. It helped that I knew what to expect, which was a long flashback into the gunslinger's past. It's about how Roland met the love of his life, Susan, while he and his gunslinger mates investigated a conspiracy in the village of Hambry. Susan was betrothed to the mayor, who was much older than her, and her prim and proper aunt thought there was nothing unseeming about this match at all. So it's no wonder Susan hooked up with Roland, especially upon learning that some local roughnecks were helping an infamous traitor to the kingdom. Did this long flashback need to be told? Probably not, but hell, it's just a fun and sordid fantasy story with guns, quips, villains, and sex. The beginning chapters are pretty interesting, with our heroes learning why it's important that Roland reach the Dark Tower. The ending chapters are the real disappointment of this book, as they're basically King's homage to The Wizard of Oz. Our heroes enter the Emerald City and put on ruby slippers. It's really silly. The fifth entry is Wolves of the Kala. If you're thinking werewolves, you don't know Stephen King very well. It was published a good 6 years after the last volume, while King had been pumping out many other books in between. I would say that's an insufferably long wait between installments, but, you know. George Martin. This is basically King's homage to, or ripoff of, you decide, the Magnificent Seven. Our heroes arrive at a village where everyone is born as a twin, and once every generation, a group of horseman raiders come to kidnap one of each pair of twins. The kidnapped children are then returned mentally handicapped, plus they grow up abnormally large. Roland and company agree to fight the wolf-masked horsemen, as well as train the locals in the art of battle. Eddie also returns to Earth to strike a deal with the owner of a lot that contains a rose, which is basically the Dark Tower on Earth. King tries to make the book interesting with suspense and backstories, but only the most hardcore of his fans would like it, I think. The final battle is about what you'd expect, but it's the revelation afterward that might make your jaw hit the floor, as Stephen King inserts his own name into the story. There's even an unsubtle reference to Harry Potter. Hell, the very name Harry Potter shows up. I wonder if King came to regret that decision. For, reasons. The sixth installment is Song of Susanna. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is my least favorite. It mostly takes place on Earth, as King sets up the building blocks for having the tower protected on Earth. It involves having two men found a corporation that will own the lot in New York that I mentioned a minute ago. This corporation is also meant to fight off another corporation owned by the bad guys. I may be in the minority here, but I think this is a pretty silly idea. It makes sense in terms of the real world, but it's basically Roland and company putting a lot of faith in an improbable plan. There's also Susanna, the conjoined personality from Odetta and Detta from earlier, who is both pregnant and possessed. There's another woman inside her, taking over her body as she tries to find the hideout of the bad guys in New York. It's imperative that she find the hideout before she gives birth, because she needs to be separated from Susanna's body. Yeah, it's a weird concept that only Stephen King would want to work with. And let's not forget the most infamous part of the book, the author's self-insertion. Yeah, this time it's not just his name in there, but the man himself. In the afterword of the seventh book, King defends his decision, stating that he doesn't like the term metafiction, since it sounds pretentious. That the only reason for the self-insertion was that since he referenced the Dark Tower universe in many other books, he felt he was part of Roland's Katet, or conjoined destiny. But no. Despite the humble and self-deprecating descriptions of himself, this is just semantics and vanity. It's the biggest writer in the world making himself a big deal in his epic story, just because he could get away with it. Or to see if he could get away with it. Don't believe me? What if George Martin someday soon releases The Winds of Winter, and readers discover he's in there, as the author? He's slamming down brewskis with Tyrion, saying that Tyrion is very lucky that his creator didn't decide to have him killed. Tyrion might punch him in the nuts, deservedly so. If that were to actually happen, how would that actually not be vanity? Overall, the sixth Dark Tower book is underwhelming. There's only one battle, and it's over with quickly. The exposition and suspense also don't work for me. The seventh, but not quite final, installment is The Dark Tower. I first read this along with the audiobook on compact disc. It was my first time doing such a thing, and it was a good experience. It's too bad then that the book ultimately proved to be a letdown. It's not all bad, of course, as the first half has decent action and suspense. Roland and company finally find the bastards who want to topple the Dark Tower, and it's not by dropping a ring into a volcano. The animal-headed bastards want to end all existence because, well, just because. Pretty weak motivation, but hey, you see it in anime all the time. There's a villain who knows that what he's doing is wrong and messed up. He atones by praying for forgiveness. Over a toilet, to remind himself that we all come from dirt and must eventually return to it. It's an odd character quirk, and I wish I saw more like it in the fantasy books I've read. It's easy to make a villain all mean and nasty, but it's tough to make one unforgettable and borderline realistic like that. The second half of the book is where the disappointment starts to settle in. The author himself returns, and I think it's his way of dealing with the trauma of facing his own mortality after a vehicle accident. Understandable, but couldn't he have found some other way? Roland and his remaining companions then travel across a barren land. And it's pretty tedious, despite a nasty monster King threw in. At one point, a vital character is killed off in a quick and unsatisfying way. And the same goes for the death of his killer. I definitely got the feeling that King wanted to wrap up the book quickly and get it the hell done with. Spoiler warning, Roland does reach the Dark Tower, and there is the final battle against the villain supreme whom readers have been hearing about for quite some time. And what the hell? I won't reveal too much, but I think King wanted the confrontation to end in a unique fashion, and I can respect that. But I can't respect how unsatisfying it is. I also think that King wanted to show how the villain is so powerful that not even Roland's incredible gunslinging skills could possibly defeat him. Again, I can respect that, but it's not enough. What makes this final installment disappointing is its lack of pizzazz. King may be good at suspense and sentimentality, but a fantasy story, for that is the genre for the series, needs a big ending, full of action, shining personalities, and high stakes. In other words, pizzazz. And while that might not be King's strength, he's had endings that were better than this. It, for example, has an ending that is too weird for words, but at least it was big and had many contributing characters. The Dark Tower, as a series, promised an epic adventure, yet ended with a whimper. This ending is even lamer than that of the Game of Thrones show. There's another installment called The Wind Through the Keyhole, but I never read it. Haven't read a new Stephen King book in a long time. Do I recommend this series for new readers? Sure, just be warned that disappointment starts to settle in with the fifth installment. Maybe the fourth, it depends. If anything, you might appreciate how ambitious and imaginative the story is. As for me, I'll keep reading a Magica, which is a hell of a lot shorter. So far, there's no clear hero. Not in a traditional sense, anyway. And it seems Barker was a bigger horndog than King ever was. Thank you for listening. Please check out my own books. Links are in the description below.